magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video I will be identifying some units that I think are particularly strong in the 9th edition Eldari Codex and are also especially effective for new players, and I will be giving some advice on how to use those most effectively in competitive play. Now, let's be clear about one thing before we start. Almost every unit in the 9th edition Eldari Codex could find a place in a highly effective tournament list. The current codex is just too deep to identify a handful of A-list units and honestly claim that these are the best. Nevertheless, despite having a wide variety of powerful datasheets to choose from, Craftworlds can be a challenging faction for new players. Most of the units require finesse on the part of the player piloting them and or synergies with other units and buffs in order to not be blown off the table by turn 3. So even though Asuryani are really good, they're not easy. What follows is a list of powerful Craftworlds units that will be effective tools in any roster for any of the sub-factions available to a Craftworlds player. That is, it doesn't matter if you've decided you really want to play Ulthwé or Beltane or some other mainstream Craftworld or any really any custom Craftworld combo. The units named below can be easily slotted into your list and perform well for you in the majority of your games. Now, occasionally, I will not be able to stop myself from mentioning that a particular sub-faction has something to offer one of these units that maybe others don't. But in general, these are units that will work with any sub-faction, and that isn't necessarily true of everything in the book. If you are new to Craftworlds and you want to be sure that the first models you buy will be effective on the table and still have a place in your list 6 months from now, then this video is for you. Now, to those veteran players out there who are inevitably going to want to know why such and such a unit was not included, I say this: by all means, leave your suggestions in the comments below. As I said above, I do not mean to imply that this list is a list of the objectively best units or that they're the most competitive picks in every list, only that they are effective and accessible to new players and potent, regardless of the sub-faction that the player selects. If I were to try to cover every unit that has the potential to be an A-lister with the right combos and sub-faction bonuses, I would have to talk about almost every unit in the Codex. Sorry, Storm Guardians and Farseers, you probably don't make the cut. But although I do plan to eventually provide guides for everything in the book, that's not what we're doing right now. This video is already going to be long as it is. So, without further ado, here are the units that I would recommend most strongly for new players. From the HQ section, I think you should take a serious look at Farseers and Farseer Skyrunners, at Baharroth. From the troops section, we're going to talk about Rangers. From the elites, I'm going to talk about Banshees, Scorpions, Warlock Conclaves, Wraithguard, although I think Wraithguard are probably only a good idea for less experienced players and more casual metas, but they have a lot to offer. Dire Avengers, if I did not already say it. And then for fast attack, there are a lot of great options, but I'm only going to talk about Swooping Hawks. I think these really are a standout. In the heavy support section, post data slate balance changes, I'm only going to talk about Fire Prisms and Falcons, and then at the end I'll talk about the Wave Serpent. So that's what's on the menu for today. And again, in future videos and on my website, you can find commentary about other units. But those are my picks for players new to the faction, interested in competitive play. Okay, the Farseer. The Farseer is probably the only auto-include in every serious Eldar force. If you're a new player and you're deciding what to buy, start with 2 Farseers. You want a Farseer on foot and a Farseer on a bike. This spooky Space Elf Mystic gives you access to some of the best psychic powers in all of 40k and allows you to reroll a single Strands of Fate die each battle round. And if you don't know what you should... If you're not sure what Strands of Fate are, take a look at the Codex, but you roll 6 dice before each battle round, and then you retain some of them, and they let you auto-generate 6s on certain kinds of rolls. In many lists, Farseers are the key to making the most of other units. In most of my own competitive rosters, I run at least 2 pointy-eared prophets, and occasionally I wonder if I should be running a third. Now, there are, roughly speaking, 3 different types of Farseer build. I'm going to run you through all 3. Any of these theoretically could be either on foot or on a bike, but I will say what I think is best for each. And there is some variability with each of these, and I'll talk about that too. But I think we're talking about 3 broad categories. There is the Mortal Wound Assault Seer, who gets in your opponent's face and just spams them with mortal wounds. There's a midfield debuffer Farseer with scoring potential. So this elf hangs around the midfield and puts doom on things and tries to score psychic interrogation and does some other things as well that I'll talk about. And then there's the backfield Farseer, the backline buffer. Back in 8th edition, I made a video and wrote an article about the soccer mom of space elves. So this is the new iteration of the Farseer that buoys your pointy-eared warriors with endless optimism and sunny delight. If you're not from America, you might not know what Sunny Delight is. Sorry, it's a 90s thing. Which Farseer is right for you will depend on what else is in your list and your overall plans for target elimination and scoring. So here's a quick rundown. Now, the Mortal Wound Seer is the easiest because the Mortal Wound Seer will slot into any list. It only has one job: grievous harm. And it's probably where you start with this is probably obvious. You take the 3 psychic powers that enable you to do grievous harm: Executioner, Crushing Orb, and you have Smite, and you can use the Unparalleled Mastery stratagem to cast all 3, so you're putting out, hopefully, 43 mortal wounds, ish. The Crushing Orb works a little differently, but that's about what it comes down to. Generally speaking, your Assault Seer needs to be on a jet bike. I mean, obvious reasons, right? You've got to be able to get there. On turn 1, you use Ride the Winds to move 22 inches. You could take the Relic Bike, the Sunstorm, and move 26 inches and have objective secured. I think there's better uses for that relic, but it's another option. But any event, you get on the bike, you go really far to get within range, and then you deal a barrage of mortal wounds. And then if you're clever, you don't get your Seer killed, because in order for this model to earn its wounds, it needs to be able to do this, to earn its points, excuse me, it needs to be able to do this over multiple turns. So what I think, you could use a Warlock at sort of the extreme edge of this to then cast Quicken on the Seer and pull it way back. But your other option is just to shoot something with the Shuriken Catapults and then use Battle Focus and the Matchless Agility stratagem, which guarantees a 6-inch move for Battle Focus, to pull the Farseer out of line of sight and out of range of any of your opponent's melee units or anything that's going to be able to move and get in range of it. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that these builds are intended, or these units are intended to be good in any list, but I will say that if you're running Ulthwé or Beltan, you have some relics available that will give you the ability to have a Farseer know an additional power, and if you decide to do this with your Assault Seer, it's probably going to be Doom or Ghostwalk or even Mind War. I'm not going to talk about the Mind War build here because I have an upcoming video where I'm going to go way down that rabbit hole. I think that lots of people think Mind War is only for casual play. I think that's mostly true, but I think it's only mostly true. Doom is amazing for obvious reasons. I'm going to talk about Doom in a moment. Ghostwalk is the power that lets you give +2 to a unit that is attempting a charge +2 to the charge roll. You probably only want to do this if you're running a lot of melee units and at least one of them is coming in from Deep Strike. There's a combo whereby you use a Strands of Fate die to guarantee a 6-inch charge on one of the 2 charge dice. So the worst charge you could roll is a 7, and then with the +2 from Ghostwalk, you can auto succeed on the charge coming in out of Deep Strike. So if that's in your list, that could be good too. But for them, I think most of you are probably just looking at the 3 powers. One other note on particular subfaction builds: the very best way to build an Assault Seer, if you're doing this and you really want to make this work, the custom Craftworld trait Hail of Doom makes an Assault Seer just completely insane. You give it the relic Kernus's Bow, or Kernus Bow, and the Warlord trait Mark of the Incomparable Hunter, and you reserve a Strands of Fate die to assure a hit roll of 6. Now, I'm not going to, this is a little bit complicated. I'm not going to explain all of it here because I have an upcoming video on just how to get the most out of this, and I'm going to talk about it for a long time. But for those of you who are motivated, you could just look up Kurnus' Bow, Mark of the Incomparable Hunter, and Hail of Doom and work out how you will average 8 mortal wounds in the shooting phase on pretty much any target after you've already dealt 43 mortal wounds in the psychic phase, and then you run away like I described before. And so, I mean, that's crazy. You're putting out like 14 mortal wounds a turn for as long as you can keep the seer up, and it's going to be pretty hard to eliminate. If you are doing this, I would suggest that your second custom Craftworld trait be Children of Prophecy, which lets you reroll dice rolls of 1 or 2 in the psychic phase. One of the players over on Art of War, who's a better player than I am, does this with the trait that lets you ignore cover, masterful shots. But I really think, despite the fact that he's a better player, I'm gonna contradict and say I think Children of Prophecy is a better pick if you're running a lot of psych. It depends on what's in your list. Probably for what he's running, he's chosen the right thing. Okay, the midfield debuffer with scoring potential. So this is Farseer number 2. I should come up with a quippier, shorter name for this guy, or even better, you suggest one in the comments below. If you have an idea for what I should a quippy name for the midfield seer, leave it in the comments below. This is a squirrely space elf commander that hovers around the front of your deployment zone or in the rear of the midfield, out of line of sight, putting doom on enemy targets. That's the primary job, and this is going to synergize really well with rosters that have a lot of shuriken fire in them, and that want to lean into Warpcraft secondaries. So the Assault Seer can work in any list, but this midfield Seer, you really want it in lists with shuriken fire and the lists that want the option to either take Warp Ritual or Mental Interrogation to score secondary points. I would suggest most of the time you're probably going to want to take Doom and then Will of Azurian. Will of Azurian will enable elite units to strip enemy units of objectives by suddenly magically declaring that they have objectives secured. In general, though, if this guy's attempting a psychic action, or I suppose this gal, or I guess gender-neutral pointy ear, I don't know. Most of the time, you're only going to cast a single psychic power because you're likely to do some psychic action. So, and that's, again, if you're doing Warp Ritual or Mental Interrogation, you can then use the Multifaceted Mind stratagem. I think I said Multifaceted Mind above when I meant Unparalleled Mastery. Unparalleled Mastery is what enables you to cast 3 times. Multifaceted Mind is what enables you to attempt a psychic secondary and then still cast a psychic power. If you didn't know that casting psychic power or doing psychic actions prevents you from actually casting spells, it's sad but true. It's in the rules. But Craftworlds have this special tool whereby their Farseers can still cast one of their powers for 1 CP. So maybe you're doing a psychic action, or maybe a scoring psychic action, or maybe your psychic action is empowering Eldritch Storm. The other advantage to this forward seer is that you're likely to be within 24 inches of a good target point for Eldritch Storm. Eldritch Storm is a 3-point stratagem, so that's a lot. That lets you put a count in your command phase. You set down a counter within 24 inches of your Farseer, and then at the end of your psychic phase, I think, everything within 6 inches of that counter, so that's a 12-inch bubble, takes D3 mortal wounds plus 1 mortal wound for every time it's been empowered by a Farseer. Even if you just empower this once, 12 inches is big, right? You can create this big area where your opponent's units are all taking D3 plus 1 mortal wounds, or if you have a couple of seers and you empower it twice, D3 plus 2 mortal wounds. I mean, it's a lot. You can only use it once per game, and you often won't need to use it because what you do is you say, hey, opponent, I don't want to have any gotcha moments. You should know that I can do this thing. And you might be thinking, Brent, how does it help you if you're just being... Well, first of all, you should... it's not fun to win games because your opponent didn't know you could do something. But this is not totally altruistic. Your opponent knowing that you can do this will cause your opponent to have to think really hard about how units are clustered, maybe not position those units optimally, not make maximum use of aura abilities, and also just use up mental energy worrying about this. In most games, I find I don't need to use Eldritch Storm, but my opponent having to worry about it is still an asset. This is a stratagem that's an asset, even if you never use it. But equally important, or maybe even more important than this role as a psychic action monkey, this is your Farseer who is putting doom on stuff. Doom is an enormously valuable tool for expanding the threat profile, especially of your shuriken units. So normally your shuriken units are very, very dangerous to infantry, especially light infantry, but tanks and monsters are sort of out of their pay grade, right? But with Doom, suddenly your shuriken units pose a significant threat to enemy tanks and monsters, at least up to T7. A unit of 10 dire Avengers, for example, can reasonably hope to score at least 8 damage on a doomed target. That's at least as much as a couple of Bright Lances could hope for most of the time on average. And you can actually have them do even more with the right buffs and stratagem expenses. A unit of dire Avengers can really mess up a tank, sometimes even something at like T8. I'll talk about that when I talk about Avengers. So it's just you've exponentially, maybe you've doubled the amount of units you have on the table that pose a threat to your opponent's hard targets. You can just sort of point to one of your units and say, and now you, well, actually all of your units, because you cast it on the enemy, right? All of your core units. Suddenly this one enemy unit, the amount of tools I have for deleting this hard target is significantly greater. Banshees and Scorpions are also hugely enhanced by Doom. Normally Banshees are really, really good at killing heavily armored stuff that is T7 and below, and with Doom, now they can take out stuff that's like T8, and the stuff that's T7 and below, they're doing even more damage to. Your Scorpions struggle a little bit more with stuff that's above toughness 5. But again, with Doom, they really, wow. Because Doom also gives them an extra chance to trigger their Manda Blaster ability, which, to be fair, doesn't work against monsters and vehicles, but nevertheless makes them a whole lot more deadly. So it's just so good. Doom is so good. It doesn't require line of sight. And it's also worth pointing out that you don't have to choose the target for a Farseer power until you've made your roll. So you declare, this is going to matter for the backline seer too, who's casting Guide and Fortune. You declare that you're casting Doom, you roll 2d6, and if you get sort of an average roll, then the range for Doom is 18 inches, so you've got most of the midfield if your Farseer is well positioned. And if you roll well, it goes to 24 inches, and maybe now there's even a more ideal target for that power. So that's just a side note. You don't need to say I'm casting Doom on that. You say I'm casting Doom, you roll, and then you say what you are casting it on. In some lists, you might consider, instead of Will of Azurian as a second power for the midfield seer, you might consider Ghost Walk, for reasons I think that are obvious. I talked about Ghost Walk earlier, or maybe even Guide, or if you're only running one Farseer, it's probably going to be this Farseer, and in which case maybe you're swapping in Guide or Fortune also. But I think Doom is for sure in this role in the vast majority of lists. Now, the build. Theoretically, you could save yourself 30 points by not putting this Farseer on a jet bike and instead taking the Relic Falchu's wing, which is like Swooping Hawk wings that don't actually have the jump pack keyword, so I think actually can go in a transport, which is not usually a thing with jump units, but they give a 12-inch movement characteristic and the ability to do some mortal wounds maybe to stuff that you jump over, which can be good in the late game. I think for the most part, you should just put your midfield Farseer on a jet bike. Not only do you get even better movement, significantly better movement than Falchu's wing gives you, but you get +1 toughness and +1 wound, which is especially valuable in the late game when this unit might want to pop out and grab some objectives or smite some things. It's a consideration. Okay, the backline seer. The backline Farseer Synergizes really well with Swooping Hawks, with the Avatar of Cain, with midfield Wraith units like Wraithblades that want to charge something on an objective, and also with backfield heavy support units. So the backline Farseer stays out of line of sight at the front of your backfield. She's super easy to use, really valuable for new players. The default loadout here is Guide and Fortune. Guide lets you reroll all of your hit dice, and there's certain in either the shooting or the melee phase. And there are certain units that especially benefit from this. You can only cast it on core units, so no vehicles, but a unit of Swooping Hawks, a maxed out unit of Swooping Hawks, really benefits from Guide. Because 10 Swooping Hawks put out 40 shots, and all of their 6s to hit are auto wound. So if you're not only are you re-rolling, and that's a lot of dice with 40 dice, not only are you re-rolling a lot of dice to hit, but you're doubling the number of auto wounds. And the weapon is strength 4, so that's fine against most infantry. But with Guide, and now it's actually good against stuff that's even tougher, right? Because you get a bunch of auto wounds through, and then you do roll some 5-ups. I will say, in order for the Swooping Hawks to threaten things that are really tough, they also need JINX because they don't have AP. But nevertheless, Guide is really good here. Another great target is Dire Avengers, a big unit of Dire Avengers, because there's this stratagem Blade Storm that causes your 6s to hit to count as 6s to wound, which also triggers the Shuriken ability. And for Dire Avengers, that means those hits come in at -4 AP, because the Dire Avenger catapult is -2, and the way Shuriken works now as a keyword is that it just gets an additional -2, so the Avenger catapults go to a -4. So again, like with the Hawks, you're doubling the number of auto wounding dice, and you're getting this big AP bonus too. So it's just great. There's great synergy there. It can also be good on things like Howling Banshees and Striking Scorpions if those things are within range. There's tremendous utility for Guide. Fortune is the power that gives you a 5-up feel no pain on the target unit. It's best used on whatever unit is most likely to be targeted by your opponent. On turn 1, maybe there's like one unit. Like maybe you have, I don't know, a Wave Serpent or something that a few of your units, your opponent's very long range models can see, and so obviously then that's what gets Fortune. But generally, you're actually going to use Fortune on your most durable units, which is counterintuitive, but true, because those are the units that you're usually intentionally exposing to fire. So, for example, if you plan to run the Avatar of Cain, Fortune is completely, absolutely essential. The Avatar is expensive, and yes, it halves all incoming damage, and yes, it has an invuln, and yes, it has toughness 8, but none of this changes the fact that the Avatar is pretty killable and also vulnerable to mortal wounds. If you put Fortune on it, the math for the resources that your opponent has to expend to try to eliminate the Avatar is significantly greater, in part because, like, splitting fire is unreliable. So just the person that I play with most frequently, my training partner for serious play, Chris, he's an AdMech player. He's a really good player, and when the new codex dropped, he did a bunch of math on what he would have to use to kill my Avatar. How many bricks of Skitarii will it take to kill the Avatar if it does or does not have Fortune on it? And let me just tell you that it's you want Fortune. That's the takeaway here. It's also really good on if you're using Wraith units to try to control the midboard. And to be fair, I think Wraith units are a great pick for new players. I'm a little dubious about them on really competitive lists. I think Wraithblades have a place in those lists for sure. But regardless of your level of play, if you're running a single big unit of Wraithblades or Wraithguard, you want to put Fortune on them. Yes, they're already very tough, but they're going to be if you really need for them to just stand out there and take it, they need the buff. Okay, I'm done with my rant. I would definitely suggest that your backline Farseer gets the Warlord trait, Seer of the Shifting Vector. This is the trait that allows you to roll a d6 every time either you or your opponent spends a CP, and on a 6 you get a CP back. Now, if you look at the core rulebook, you will see that actually powers that let you regen CP are capped at 1 CP per battle round. So the most you could ever get back is 5, but nevertheless, it's really good, and statistically, you are going to get back somewhere between 1 and 3 on average per game. Sometimes you'll get lucky, you'll get 5 back. I have. But this means that even if you have to spend a CP on the stratagem that lets you take an extra warlord trait, like you've already used one somewhere else, you definitely want this, because in the vast majority of games, it will get you at least 1 CP. So it's free CP. Sphere of the Shifting Vector is free CP, and Craftworlds are pretty CP intensive. Last thing. I mentioned when I started talking about the backline Farseer that it synergizes well with backfield heavy support units. Maybe a couple people got mad because vehicles and support platforms cannot benefit from guide because they don't have core. It's not because of guide, it's because of forewarned. Forewarned is the stratagem that lets you interrupt your opponent's turn if they bring deep strikers in. Choose a unit within 12 inches of your Farseer that can see those deep strikers and then just light them up like it was the shooting phase with no penalty. That is so freaking good. Like Eldritch Storm, even if you don't use this in most games, if your opponent has deep strikers, it's a deterrent, right? So they have to think about it. And this is another one where you should say, especially if you're playing against somebody new, and when it comes time, you say, just so you know, this is a thing that I can do, that has value in and of itself. They're using up mental energy. They're making hard choices. A few final notes here before we move on. I know I've talked a lot about the Farseer. I will not talk for this long about any other unit. They're just hugely multifaceted. Do remember if you really need a power to go off, remember to use a Strands of Fate die on that power. So when you make your 2d6 roll, to see if it succeeds, you can start guaranteeing one of them is a 6. 2, if you're relying on your Farseers in a big way, consider taking a Seer Council. For 1 CP, you add some Warlocks to your army, and if they're near your Farseer, you get +1 to all the casts with the Farseer. It's generally worth doing. And then just don't forget about those other strategies. Like if you're a new player and you have the deck of cards, with all of the stratagems and the relics and everything, take out Unparalleled Mastery, Multifaceted Mind, Forewarned, Eldritch Storm, put them on the table in front of you so you don't forget about them. Last thing, do not take the Singing Spear. Don't do it. It hits really hard, auto strength 9, auto wounding sometimes, but with no AP, it will rarely pose a serious threat to any target worthy of 3 damage. If you have nothing else to do with 5 points, take it, but it's not a thing that you need to lean into. Baharroth. I'm just going to say it. Baharroth is the best HQ unit in the Codex. He's an independent operator who increases your damage output, your scoring potential, and your board control, and there is no way for an opponent to counter him unless you make big mistakes. This feathery Phoenix Lord can move 14 inches into the midfield, shoot an enemy unit with his Assault 4, Strength 6, -2 AP, flat 2 damage weapon, and then flappy flap to safety anywhere on the battlefield at least 9 inches from enemy units. So every time he shoots, he can then deep strike. Hawks can do that too. Regular Swooping Hawks can do that too, which is why they're amazing. But Baharroth can also do this after he charges an enemy unit, deals melee damage, but before the enemy hits back, so you fly away as your consolidation move. That completely rocks. Now, even though Baharroth doesn't hit quite as hard as some of the other Phoenix Lords, his absolutely insane mobility means that he is likely to fight in every single turn of the game, and he can also give himself objective secured, which means he excels at grabbing primaries and scoring late in the game. Now, because Baharroth is almost impossible to pin down or kill, he is also particularly strong on lists that make use of To the Last, the secondary that grants 5 EP at the end of the game for each of your 3 most expensive units that are still alive at the end of the last turn. So that does mean that Baharroth would have to be one of your most expensive units, but that's not that hard. He's reasonably pricey. In the unlikely event that he does die, you can attempt to resurrect him for 1 CP using the Phoenix Reborn stratagem. It's a dice roll, but it's absolutely worth attempting. You can only do it once per game. The only way to really screw up with Baharroth is to either, when you reposition him, not realize that your opponent can move and charge him or move and shoot him, or both. Phoenix Lords can't take more than 3 damage in a single phase. So even if you did make a mistake and your opponent was able to shoot Baharroth in a single turn. Baharroth could not be killed. The more likely way things can go wrong, I assume that most of you will keep an eye on what your opponent can do. The easier way to make a mistake is for Baharroth to fail a charge. So if you decide you're not going to fly away after you shoot, but instead you want to charge and you fail your charge roll, well, now you're not going to get a consolidation move, so you don't get to battle focus away. And now he's stuck within range of an enemy who can shoot him and then charge him, and that could potentially be game over unless Phoenix Reborn works. So the way to avoid this is to just never attempt a charge move of more than 5 inches unless you have a Strands of Fate die to guarantee its success. And because Baharroth is so fast, like this, it's not that hard. Usually you can put him, often you can put him within, like when he moves initially, you can put him within 3 inches from the unit. So you literally can't fail. But even if you are making a 5-inch charge, so even if you're making a very short charge, 5 or 4 inches, right? So you don't need Strands of Fate, do have a command reroll in your back pocket just in case things go completely pear-shaped. But he's great. Great for scoring, great for killing, so good, easy to use. Rangers. Rangers are essential in almost every Craftworld's list. I think Farseers are essential in every Craftworld's list. Rangers, the vast majority. Not only are they the most points efficient way to fill a troop slot, but they enable Craftworld's players to control and screen the midfield before the game even begins, right? Because Rangers have that advanced positions power. So when you deploy them, they can deploy anywhere in the midfield as long as they're not within 9 inches of your enemy's either deployment zone or enemy units. Rangers are a high skill cap unit, and they might require significant practice to master. High skill cap means in order to get the most out of them, you've got to be pretty good. But even if you're not a hugely experienced Craftworlds player, they can do really good work for you. When you position them, you do need to take into account the speed and disposition of your opponent's melee units and their highly mobile shooting units, so you know whether or not they're vulnerable. In order to be able to deploy them optimally, you need to know this about your opponent. Don't be afraid to ask questions too. Most opponents will be happy to answer. Even very new players can find the Rangers are just like total game changers. Here's what they do for you. Here's a list of things they do for you. They provide midfield objective control from turn 1. So if there's a midfield objective that's completely out of line of sight of the opponent, potentially you just stick your Rangers on it. You control it from the beginning of the game. That also means that if you're playing one of those missions that only lets you generate CP if you already control a midfield objective, you are getting CP on turn 1 when normally you couldn't. More importantly, they're a way of blocking fast and powerful enemy melee units, preventing them from crossing the board too quickly. Sometimes you have to sacrifice your Rangers to do this, sometimes you don't. Rangers provide early game scoring for secondary objectives like retrieve Nachman data and engage on all fronts, because you can have those forward quadrants from the start of the game. They're also a good way of screening out your opponent's own units that can forward deploy, because those units can't be deployed within 9 inches of your Rangers. They contribute low-cost finishing fire for badly damaged hard targets and characters. Right, so if there's an enemy tank that has like 1 wound left after you've blasted it with your Fire Prisms or whatever, you can just try to pop it with your Rangers, because on a 6 to wound they do a mortal, and you can always just use a Strands of Fate die to guarantee that they do that mortal, instead of having to use yet another heavy weapon that could have performed more optimally, hitting something where it could do more damage, hit the thing again. So they're great. They're a great finishing unit. Lastly, they can provide rerolls for your indirect fire weapons if the target is within 12 inches. Now, indirect fire weapons have been hugely nerfed since the balance slate, so you might not be running. There was a time when Night Spinners were definitely going to be on this list, and now they're not. But if you are running Night Spinners, and I still think Night Spinners are still good, they're just a lot harder to use well. But if you are using Night Spinners, you definitely need Rangers, and try to position them to let them reroll all of their hit rolls, because now indirect fire reduces your ballistic skill by 1. Okay, so here's some do's and don'ts for Rangers. Again, Rangers are tricky. 1, if your opponent also has units that can deploy in the midfield, then do deploy your Rangers before you deploy anything else in your army. This is because you want to be able to control where your opponent can put their own forward deploying units. For example, if they have something that's like a pretty powerful melee unit, like their equivalent of Striking Scorpions or Striking Scorpions, maybe you're playing a Craftworlds player, you want to position your Rangers such that they won't be able to put that unit anywhere near a vulnerable part of your back line. So that's one thing. Also, if you yourself are running Striking Scorpions, you can use your Rangers to create a hole, essentially, where your opponent won't be able to screen out your Scorpions. So in this way, you put the Rangers down first. That creates a 9-inch, or I guess an 18-inch bubble where your opponent can't plant their forward deployment units, and that will give you places to put your Rangers while still holding your Rangers back, or your Scorpions, while still holding your Scorpions back until your opponent has deployed pretty much everything. You want to put your Scorpions down last. When I talk about Scorpions, I'll talk about why, and Rangers can help you do that. Hopefully that wasn't too obtuse. That was complicated. You do want to use your Rangers to retrieve Nachman data. Remember that troops units, so now for Nachman data, you have to roll equal to or under the number of models in the unit to succeed, but if it's a troops unit, you're at +1. So 5 Rangers can auto-succeed on turn 1 at Nachman data. I think you do want to consider giving at least 1 unit of Rangers a wire weave net. This is a 5-point piece of war gear that triggers when an opponent declares a charge against the Rangers. You roll a d6, and on a 2-up, the wire weave net does d3 immortal wounds and reduces the charge by 2. I will also mention that if you went first and you moved some Warlocks up out of line of sight behind the Rangers and restrained the charging unit, it's very likely that they'll just fail their charge, because restrain halves the move characteristic, and then the wire weave net, my goodness, they're just stuck there. So this is a way of taking a really powerful opposing melee unit, just doing some mortal wounds to it, and basically taking it completely out of the game for a turn, which is, for a unit that relies on melee to earn its points, devastating. I already mentioned using your Rangers as finishing fire. But do remember that when you're doing that, you can use the fire and reposition stratagem to move into a ruin with Rangers, shoot something, and then guarantee that you will be able to battle focus out of the ruin. So normally, when you cross the footprint of terrain using battle focus, you have to subtract 3. So there's always like a 50-50 chance if you try to move into a ruin and battle focus out of it. It's 50-50 whether you're going to be able to pull it off. And a unit of Rangers can spend a CP to be sure that they can do this, while still leaving that fire and fade stratagem for 1 CP to be used on some other unit, like that Farseer that I mentioned that might want to blast something and then battle focus. Not fire and fade, excuse me, matchless agility. They might want to battle focus with matchless agility out of line of sight. Fire and fade is the thing that you do. The advantage to fire and fade is 2 CP now, but you can use it even on models that don't have battle focus. So that's the advantage there. Do consider occasionally sacrificing a unit of Rangers by moving them forward aggressively to block an enemy unit from moving more than 2 inches. So sometimes it really is going to be worth just making an advance move with some Rangers out of line of sight and setting them up like 1.5 inches in a line from some enemy unit, so that they like slam into the Rangers and nothing behind can get through, and you just create this logjam. Yeah, the Rangers are going to die, but the tactical advantage to that can be considerable. Knowing when it's appropriate to do requires a lot of practice, but it's something that should at least be in your thoughts as a possible use for them. It can be a great way to block transports that don't fly. If your opponent has like one of those irritating AdMech drills in their deployment zone, if you can stop that from making any significant progress on turn 1, it's pretty freaking good. Do remember that you can use the Resonator Sard stratagem. That's the way that I mentioned earlier. You can give a reroll to your indirect fire weapons when they target something within 12 inches of the Rangers. Just remember that that's there. So that's Rangers. Okay, Wraithguard with Wraith Cannons. These guys are a great pick for new players in a casual meta. They're easy to use, quick to paint, narratively awesome, objectively. Wraithguard are a solid include, both as hard target elimination and also for objective control, especially with appropriate buffs. I already mentioned the importance of Fortune. They can also help you score the secondary objective behind enemy lines and engage on all fronts pretty effectively. If you decide to run a unit of Wraithguard, there's one way to do it. You take 5 to 7 of them, stick them in reserve using Webway's Strike, and then bring them in on turn 2 or 3 to really put the hurt on something with those Wraith Cannons that are Strength 10, -4 AP, D3 plus 3 damage. Awesome. I prefer the Wraith Cannon to the D-Scythe because it's 5 points cheaper, has better range, can be fired in melee. It doesn't have the blast keyword, right? There are going to be some targets that the Scythe would be more effective against, but I think the Wraith Cannon overall is just more optimal. Despite the inherent durability of Wraithguard, you need to buff them defensively if you're really going to make them a target. In addition to Fortune, lightning fast reactions is really good. That makes them -1 to hit. I always think it's sort of funny to imagine Wraiths suddenly being lightning fast, but the rules allow for it. It creates significant inefficiencies in target elimination for your opponent. New players often underestimate just how mathematically significant -1 to hit really is. So that's solid pick. Although Wraiths will work for any sub-faction, it's just a solid data sheet, they're especially sticky in Ulthway lists. You would think it would be Eandon, but really Ulthway lists, because with the Strands of Fate die, if you set aside Strands of Fate rolls of 6, that's an armor save. So in an Ulthway list, all of the models have a 6-up invuln. So your Wraiths, even if they get targeted by something with -4 AP, will still always save on a 6. If you use the Strands of Fate die, you can guarantee that happens. And Ulthway Wraithguard also benefit from a 5-up Feel No Pain against mortal wounds, which is great because that's one of the most efficient ways to deal with units like Wraiths that not only have good armor and are tough to wound, but also from conventional weapons, -1 to incoming damage to a minimum of 1, but that doesn't apply to mortal wounds. So the 5-up Feel No Pain against mortal wounds is great. So anything will work, any faction will work for Wraiths, but Ulthway really does have an advantage here. All that said, the effectiveness of Wraithguard drops off dramatically in matchups against serious tournament players with high-performing lists. These sorts of players will know how to prevent you from putting Ghost Warriors within range of appropriate targets. They'll just screen really effectively. And if they do let you get something in there, it will generally be against something with a good invuln save and some sort of hit modifier that you'll suddenly be surprised just how little damage those cannons do. Maybe one of them goes through, maybe. Such lists are also likely to have ways around the durability of the Wraiths. So in those matchups, I think your Ghost Soldiers are not likely to earn their points. But look at it this way. If your meta includes people who regularly go 4-1 at grand tournaments, or who are, maybe for personal reasons, they can't get to those, but they're running clones of lists that recently won big opens and never miss an episode of Art of War or something, then Wraithguard are not a good investment. But if your meta is average, semi-competitive, or like a beer and pretzels play group, Wraiths are going to be really easy to use and really rewarding. Wraithblades with Ghost Axes and Force Shields. Wraithblades with Ghost Axes and Force Shields are the toughest infantry available to Craftworld's players. They're good for target elimination, good for objective control, and invaluable for keeping a portion of the board or your opponent's army firmly pinned down. They will also take the pressure off of other units in your list, as they are resource intensive for an opponent to eliminate. Now, they're not an auto-include, not even close for a serious Craftworld's list, but they're relatively easy to use for new players in a casual meta, and they've also appeared in some very high-performing tournament lists piloted by pros. They do have play at high levels. The most effective, again, like the Wraithguard, I think there's kind of like one way. Here's the other nice thing about the Wraithblades. There's really one way to use them. The most effective way to use Wraithblades is to start 5 to 10 of them in Deep Strike using Webway Strike, bring them in turn 2, or 3, auto succeed on that 9-inch charge using the combination I already explained with Strands of Fate and Ghost Walk, and slam something. Now, I would advise also doing the following. I already mentioned the importance of Fortune on durable units. Even if they have that 4-up invuln, and even though they're -1 to damage, if you want these guys to be a big part of your list, you probably need to cast Fortune on them. You may also need to use lightning fast reactions. A big unit of Wraithblades that's -1 to hit, 3 up save, 4 up invuln, 5 up feel no pain, -1 to incoming. That is just incredibly difficult to chew through. They're nigh on unshiftable. But they're also really expensive at 45 points a mod. This is a seriously crazy investment. So you do need to further enhance their durability for them to earn their keep. You can also use, because they have that 4 up invuln, don't be afraid to use some Strands of Fate die to auto-succeed on armor saves when they get blasted with something like a Bright Lance or a Dark Lance that would auto-kill one. Keep in mind that you can give them, if you want them to assault objectives, you may want to have Will of Azurian in your tactical quiver to give them objective secured. If you're running a big unit, more than 5, they have high leadership, but if you're running more than 5, you want to have some CP set aside for insane bravery in case you need it. You don't want your last blade running away, especially if it's pinning down something important in your opponent's list. And when you're thinking about what to hit with these things, the way to mess it up is to choose to run them into some chaff target and just feel really good about just how brutally you annihilated those Imperial Guardsmen or those Gaunts. They have to hit the right thing, and it's not always about killing the thing. Sometimes it's just about bogging it down, getting it stuck there, or creating some sort of big logjam, and just you create the situation where they're so hard to get rid of, your opponent can kind of like never be rid of them. As you devote resources to keeping them alive, don't be afraid to use Tears of Isha. That's the stratagem that lets you heal D3, or just 3 if you've got a Spirit Seer nearby, but may not have a Spirit Seer. They're tough enough that even if you're paying a CP to only get a wound or 2 back, it really might be worth it. Keeping these guys on the board, if you're using them well, is the key to them doing their jobs. If you are going to run a unit of these and it's going to be more than 5, you might want to consider To the Last as one of your go-to secondaries. What To the Last does is it gives you 5 points at the end of the game for every one of your 3 most expensive units that are still alive. If you're running these guys, guaranteed, these are going to be one of them. And you then create the situation where your opponent, even if your opponent has a fast list that could play around them, your opponent just can't really afford to ignore them completely, or there's this big penalty at the end of the game when you get to score 5 points. Howling Banshees. Howling Banshees are one of the most powerful melee tools available to a Craftworld's player. These screamy murder elves are fast, hard-hitting, and easy to add to virtually any roster. Although there are a number of ways to assemble a Banshee squad, there is one build that stands out as the obvious pick if you are running only a single unit. 4 regular Banshees accompanying an Exarch with Mirror Swords and the Exarch power Piercing Strike. The result is a squad that puts out 22 attacks on the charge, 10 from the Exarch, because remember the Mirror Swords double the attack characteristic, which is now a 5, because you have the Exarch power, it goes up 1. At Strength 4, so 10 attacks, Strength 4, with +1 to the wound roll on the charge, -3 AP, flat 2 damage. The other 4 Banshees give you 12 attacks at Strength 4, +1 to wound on the charge, -4 AP, a little better, 1 damage, and you get all of that for 105 points. Oh, they also shut down Overwatch, are -1 to hit in both the shooting and melee phases, and force enemy units in engagement range to fight last. That's so good. I can't overemphasize, by the way, how good +1 to wound on the charge is. It's +1 to the die roll, not just +1 to your strength. So that means that even models that are toughness 7 are wounded by Banshees on a 4+ when they charge, which is great. And even stuff that's like toughness 8, even is wounded on a 5. So if you doom it, oh my goodness. Like if you cast Doom on something that's toughness 8, wounding on 5s, but then re-rolling failed wounds is better than wounding on 4s. So they just hit monstrously hard. The only challenge to using Banshees well is getting them into position to strike first against ideal targets without either getting tripped up by screens of chaff or getting charged themselves before they can make their move. In order to play around this, I suggest either sticking them in a transport or bringing them in from deep strike with the Ghost Walk plus Strands of Fate move that I've already described twice elsewhere in the video, where you auto-succeed on the charge. Whatever you do, I think you want to be a little conservative with your Banshees. You hold them back for a turn or two while you clear out that chaff, or you get the transport into position. I usually prefer to stick my shrieky Ladies of Cain in a Wave Serpent and position them out of line of sight roughly in the center of the midfield, because from here they can jump out a few inches from the Serpent, use Strands of Fate to guarantee that their advance and charge ability gets them into engagement range of anything in the midboard. Alternatively, instead of the Serpent, you could start them in a Falcon. The advantage to bring in a Falcon instead for your Banshees instead of a Serpent is that theoretically you could deep strike with them on turn 1, because they can jump out of the Falcon the turn they arrive, and the Falcon has this turn 1 deep strike power. But a really skilled opponent probably won't let you get to anything good with them on turn 1. So there are other reasons to think about the Falcon. If you take a Falcon in your list for the opportunity to make split moment decisions about how you're going to play it, I'll talk about it when we get to the Falcon. I think I prefer mine in a Serpent. If you decide you want to include more than one squad of Banshees, you obviously need to consider some alternative builds, because each XR power is capped at once per army. So should you include a second unit, consider the same build with the Mirror Swords, but with the Exarch power Nerve Shredding Shriek and the Exarch relic, the Crone Scream. Together, these will enable the squad to do D3 plus 2 mortal wounds on the charge, which totally balances out the loss of any extra damage from Piercing Strike. Then you have 2 ridiculously good squads. If you aren't running 2 squads, it's also well worth considering giving that Crone Scream to the first squad if you have the CP to spare. Remember, for 1 CP with Relics of the Shrines, you actually get 2 Shrine Relics for 2 different Exarchs. I think it's usually worth doing. Maybe the Crone Screen is going to be one of those. Lastly, although Banshees do very well unbuffed, they benefit in a big way from Enhance or Guide. I already mentioned Doom. Doom is the best, but Enhance and Guide are very, very good. Guide lets them reroll misses. Enhance lets them hit on 2s. And don't forget to shoot with those shuriken pistols before you charge. It's really easy to forget about the shuriken pistols, but now that they have a little bit of AP, which they did not in the previous edition, they can really do some work for you. If you do play your Banshees well, a single squad should more than earn its points, even in the most challenging matchups, pretty much every time you run them. Okay, let's talk Scorpions. Striking Scorpions are great for both target elimination and for dictating the circumstances of engagement in the early turns of the game, because they can deploy in the midfield 9 inches from enemies like Rangers, and even in games where your Scorpions aren't racking up kills to add to their competitive tallies back at the Exarch Shrine, I like to imagine they compete, they're helping you win by limiting how your opponent can deploy her models. And this is because with the appropriate combos, Scorpions can threaten pretty much any unit in the game. If you're running 1 squad, here's the build that I suggest. 4 regular Scorpions plus an Exarch with the Biting Blade and the Exarch power Crushing Blow. In this iteration, your Exarch will have 7 attacks that automatically wound the target if they hit. That's what Crushing Blows does. Coming at -2 AP, flat 2 damage, and 6s to hit will generate additional hits. Because of the auto wound mechanic and the decent AP, the Striking Scorpion Exarch is dangerous even to tanks and monsters. So again, they auto wound if they hit. So even against something that's like T8, your Exarch, that's no problem for an Exarch with Crushing Blows. The other 4 Scorpions contribute an additional 12 attacks that generate yet additional hits on 6s. All those come in at strength 5, -1 AP, 1 damage, and your 6s to wound add an extra mortal wound on top of the other damage for the Manda Blasters if you're not engaged with a tank or a vehicle. Now, there's a slight lawyery complexity here to how this works. So any 6s to hit that generate additional hits cannot then, in the wound roll, generate the Manda Blaster cannot trigger the Manda Blaster, so you have to roll those dice separately. It does slow things down a little bit. It's a little annoying, but they're very powerful. They put out a ton of wounds. The profile on those other 4 Scorpions will absolutely shred infantry, and if you are engaged with something really tough, like you have your Exarch pounding on some high toughness monster, the Scorpions will still contribute a couple of additional wounds too, and so you can do the same amount of damage to a hard target that you would expect to do with a couple of Bright Lances or some other anti-hard target, really hard hitting thing. The trick to using Scorpions effectively is to know how to deploy and how to reposition them if necessary. So generally, you want your Scorpions to be the last unit you place on the board, and this is so that your opponent can't be sure where to anticipate a first turn charge in her backfield. When it comes time to place your Scorpions, you want to be able to move and charge a key unit on turn 1. So either you put them where there's something that's vulnerable, or you choose a place in your opponent's line where you can create a critical logjam. And this is an advanced technique for more experienced players, and in high-level play, your opponent's probably not going to feed you a really good unit, but you may be able to do this. So what you do is your Scorpions charge in, they do some killing, but they're engaged with 1 or more units that are not going to be able to take them out, so that at the beginning of your opponent's turn, a big chunk of her army is just trapped in her backfield in the movement phase because they just can't get around the Scorpions, or they can't get away from the units that are engaged with them. You create this movement logjam that could potentially slow a big chunk of the army down by a full turn. That's huge. While her units are stuck spending that full turn dealing with your sneaky aspect ninjas, your other elves are casually seizing midfield objectives and dictating the terms of engagement in the middle of the table. So they're just a huge, in addition to the killing thing, they're just a huge tactical advantage. Now, in the event that you don't get first turn, some of you are wondering, don't my Scorpions just die if they were 9 inches from the enemy line? Well, you can use the Phantasm stratagem to pick up your Scorpions and either put them into reserve for free, or to deploy them into your own backfield as counterchargers, or units that move up to then cover your Rangers. So if something charges a unit of Rangers, you cut it up with the Scorpions. Be aware, however, that you cannot use Phantasm to reposition your Scorpions elsewhere in the midfield, because the advanced positions ability only applies if you read it during the deployment phase, which is over by the time you're using Phantasm. I missed that on my first read through of the Codex, but it's definitely a thing. If you do put your Scorpions into reserve, remember that you can use the Strands of Fate plus Ghost Walk trick to ensure that they auto-succeed on a charge the turn that they come in from a board edge. So you can't at that point use Webway Strike, but you can bring them in on a board edge the way you would with any unit coming in from reserve, and hit your opponent that way. That's often, if you have a character with Ghost Walk, that's often going to be the move, I think. Lastly, if you decide to take a second unit of Scorpions, I would advise sticking with the Biting Blade. It's really good. And if you can spare the points, consider Deadly Ambush as a second Exarch power, which gives you additional offensive bonuses against units that are in cover. So basically, if your Scorpions are all in cover, they get a bonus. And this means that if you're assaulting a unit that's, say, in a ruin, you get a bonus. It's particularly good against armies that have power armor, because the AP on the Biting Blade isn't great, and the new Armor of Contempt rule for power armor is such that Marines or Sisters could just blow off the AP on your regular chain swords, and so the additional AP helps get around that. Don't bother, by the way, with the Relic Sword. It's just not worth it. Okay, Warlocks. Warlocks are another unit that I have a lot to say about. These are the Farseers. These are the big ones. So, well, first we're going to talk Foot Conclaves, and then we're going to talk Skyrunner Conclaves, and I'll talk about a couple of different builds. So, and before we get into Foot Conclaves, the Skyrunner Conclave is usually going to be the better pick. So let's just say that. But I do want to spend a little bit of time discussing the virtues of Foot Locks, because they're just so darned efficiently pointed. you can take 1 to 6 models at 20 points per model, well, 2 to 6, I guess, or a single Warlock at 40 points, but then it gets the character keyword. If there are at least 4 models in the unit, they know an extra psychic power from the Ruins of Battle, so long as at least 4 models remain alive, and they can also cast an extra power. So either you have the singleton character Warlock at 40 points, or you have more that if you have 4 of them, they get an extra cast, and there's some additional advantages to being a larger conclave. In general, I think you do want to go with the multi-model conclave, in part because that single model can be killed by Perils of the Warp. Like, their wound characteristic is low enough that you can Perils and just die. And the 2022 nerfs to indirect fire have made... So one of the problems in the beginning of 9th edition with a foot conclave, or even after the Codex dropped, was that it was pretty easy to kill... Because conclaves don't have the character keyword, with indirect fire, it was pretty easy to just wipe them out. But now there's indirect fire is much worse. Like, there's a penalty to hit, and then there's a bonus to the armor save. So your Warlocks are significantly safer. The character keyword is no longer as important as it was. And if you're going to run a single Warlock, also just put it on a jet bike. I'll talk below about why that's the move. It's not that much. I mean, I guess it is maybe 25 more points to put it on a jet bike, but it's worth it. We'll talk about why. So in general, there are 2 places for a foot conclave on the board. And this makes them, I think, sort of easy to think about. There's really only two options. One is to accompany a backline Farseer who's benefiting from Seer Council, right? That's the stratagem that gives the Farseer a bonus to all of her casts as long as the Warlock Council is nearby. Or you can position your conclave in the midfield, well screened and out of line of sight, while it hands out buffs like Quicken, Protect, Enhance, or debuffs like JINX, Restrain. I think you either want to start with 2 models and keep it cheap, or to go to 4 to 5 models and get the extra cast. There is also an additional special advantage to a large conclave, and that's access to the Battle Psychers stratagem, which for 1 CP enables a unit of Warlocks with at least 4 models to manifest both versions of a power from the Runes of Battle discipline when it succeeds on a cast. Now, for the foot conclave, I think the most likely candidate is going to be Protect JINX. However, there's a whole different... I've said there's kind of 2 ways to run the foot conclave. Actually, there's a third, which I'm going to talk about in an upcoming video, because it's a little bit more... It's a little bit marginal, and it's a little bit boutique. But it involves a drop pod of Warlocks coming in with a Farseer. We'll talk about it. And just in case you had in mind speaking of drop pod Warlocks, some crazy scheme where you give 6 Warlocks singing spears and have them jump out of a transport to like jinx something to get around the lack of AP and then blast it and charge it, I'm going to stop you right there. Is that plan cool? Absolutely. Is it worth 170 points in competitive play? Absolutely not. Save your assault locks for crusade play. It's a really fun idea, but there are a variety of reasons why it's just not a good investment. All right, let's talk about Skyrunners. So Skyrunner conclaves max out at 3 elves. So the 3 elf Skyrunner conclave, you're taking 3 or 1. There's no reason to take 2, because at 3, the triple elf Skyrunner conclave knows 2 runes of battle powers and can cast 2 powers as long as there are at least 3 models in the unit. Now, I don't know why when they get on bikes they don't need 4 anymore, but apparently the bikes really enhance their psychic abilities somehow. The Skyrunner Conclave is an enormously powerful tool. I think it's the best overall way to include a unit of Warlocks in your list, especially since, again, that 2022 balanced data slate nerfed indirect fire, which was the boogie obstacle, I guess, of Conclaves before. But this unit is now pretty easy to keep out of harm's way. It wasn't before. My favorite loadout, power loadout, for the triple bike Conclave is to take Protect JINX and also Quicken Restrain. So you always have the option, because they're on the bikes and they have that ride the wind power, to make an advance move of 22 inches, cast JINX on a key enemy unit, and then quicken that same bike unit that just cast JINX 22 inches back to safety. Long bomb JINX is gone. In the old codex, there was a way to make a 36-inch JINX cast, and you can't do that anymore. So this is the new long bomb JINX. Alternatively, you might just move 16 inches on turn 1 so that you can cast Smite on something and cast Restrain. So an interesting move. Restrain is often overlooked, but the ability to have the movement characteristic of especially an enemy melee unit is super powerful. It also, I mentioned earlier, has crazy synergy with the Wireweave Net if you're screening with some scouts. Restrain is good. So you pop them out on turn 1, you cast Smite and Restrain. Brent, why only 16 inches? Because, imaginary future listener, you can then fire with your shuriken catapults also. And the 6 shuriken catapults on the 3 bikes are no joke. That's some real fire. 12 shots, strength 4, -1 AP, better on 6s. And then they battle focus, right? So you battle focus out of line of sight. If you didn't need matchless agility somewhere else, maybe you even do it with matchless agility. You probably don't need to. You want to keep them behind a ruin or something and keep them well screened so they're not going to be hunted down by an opponent easily. In most lists, that's the triple bikes. In most lists, that's the strongest play. But there is also the singleton Skyrunner. So if you take only a single elf in a Skyrunner Conclave, the point cost nearly doubles for that one elf, but the unit gets the character keyword again. And the advantages here are obvious. There are some reasons to do this. For one thing, the model can now make use of Lookout Sir. So that is, it receives protection from other models because it has the character keyword. If those models are closer and to the enemy and also close to the Warlock. Also, a character is eligible to perform psychic actions and receive relics, and regular Warlocks are not. So now your singleton Warlock could use a Warpcraft secondary or do some other psychic action thing that I'm not thinking of. They can't empower Eldritch Storm, but there's probably something else that they can do. And the ability to take relics is huge because you can take the Sunstorm relic bike, which increases their movement characteristic to 20 and grants them objective secured. And that's just crazy because now you have this 65-point character or 60-point character maybe that can advance 26 inches and then quicken another 26 inches. So that means you've got like a 52-inch movement. You can grab any objective on the board with this. That's incredible. So in the late game, when there isn't a lot left on the table, your Sunstorm Warlock that was, just, I don't know, using Smite and Fire and Fate. We don't say Fire and Fate anymore. Smite and Battle Focus, or maybe quickening some units in your list early, suddenly can pop out and steal objectives. It's so good. It's such a powerful tool. Dire Avengers. Howling Banshees may have my heart, but Dire Avengers have earned my deep and abiding respect. If you don't already own 10 of these, you should stop listening to this video and go to your local game. Or if you're listening while driving, just go to your local game store, buy 10 of them, be late wherever it is you were going. They really are that good. So I think the build is this, right? 9 regular Avengers accompanied by an Exarch sporting 2 shuriken catapults. This 120-point unit is one of the most powerful mid-board control tools that you can have. With the right buffs, they can seriously mess up anything T7 or less. And with judicious use of matchless agility, they're really difficult for an opponent to eliminate. 10 Avengers with 11 shuriken catapults put out 33 shots at strength 4, -2 AP, flat 1 damage. But then if you pop the Blade Storm stratagem for 1 CP, all their 6s to hit generate additional hits. And then consider the crazy synergy with Guide. If they also have Guide on them, you're then rerolling all of the misses, and all of those 6s also generate additional hits. But the real key is to cast Doom on the target. If you're taking 10 Dire Avengers, you need Doom in your list. And this will enable your Avengers to reroll all of the wounds, doubling your chances of triggering the Shuriken ability and taking the AP to -4. This becomes just like fabulous volume of fire. It gets around invuln saves. It gets around high toughness, good armor. It's so good. It's so good. You can make it even better though. If you invest 25 points in the Shredding Fire ability, your AP -4 Shuriken triggers now on a 5 or a 6, which means against, say, like a unit of Space Marines, your 10 Avengers making use of Bladestorm and Doom deliver 14 wounds at -4 AP and 7 wounds at -2 with very like low average dice. That's brutal. And perhaps best of all, they can just keep using Matchless Agility to just step out of the footprint, in and out of the footprint of a ruin, so they just keep disappearing on your opponent's turn. They're just very hard to deal with. Now, in the event that your opponent manages to pick off a couple of these with indirect fire or like a speedy bike unit that can draw a bead on them, you can then make use of Avengers of Azurian, which is a 2-point stratagem that enables your unit of Avengers, if it's below its starting strength, to fire twice in your shooting phase, and all of those buffs will then trigger both times. So if your opponent kills a few of these, they actually just get better. Lastly, although your Avengers are a killer addition to a roster from any craft world, should you decide to run a custom craft world, Hail of Doom is sick, as they say, with this unit, because all of your 6s to hit automatically wound the target and come in at -4 AP. And then if you have Guide, it's now a moral and aesthetic imperative that you cast Guide on this unit. Swooping Hawks. You might think that after my gushing remarks about Banshees, Scorpions, and Avengers, I could not have any enthusiasm left for a 4th aspect shrine. Not so. Swooping Hawks are an aspiring autarch's hot, feathery dream. They're maneuverable, deadly, and well stocked with enough dirty tricks to make even the most adept Mon Kai opponents squirm with fear and frustration. 10 Swooping Hawks is one of the most sensible investments that you can make as a Craft Worlds player. A big block of Hawks could jump into the midfield every turn to lay down withering small arms fire and then jump away anywhere on the board outside of 9 inches of an opponent. So they're strong picks both for target elimination and even stronger picks for scoring. Now, you might be thinking, but Brent, that Las Blaster has no AP. Hawks just have too narrow a list of ideal targets to be optimal in take-all-comers competitive play. You can get around that limitation by just making sure that you have a speedy Warlock Skyrunner Conclave with JINX in any list that also includes Hawks. As soon as you JINX the target, it balances out. You also need to plan on casting Guide on your Hawks probably more often than not. If you are investing in that big squad, it's either going to be your Hawks or your Avengers. Guide is a particularly effective move because the Las Blaster auto wounds on unmodified hit rolls of 6. So with Guide and JINX, 10 Hawks put out 40 shots at strength 4, rerolling all the misses, auto wounding on 6s to hit, and then applying a -1 to the opponent's saving throw. That's really good. And again, the auto wounds means that they can target pretty tough units, and just because they have 40 shots, and if they're rerolling all their misses with Guide, it's more like 52 shots or something. They will, just with volume of fire, they will put some wounds on anything, even stuff that's really tough. It's also worth mentioning that JINX will get you around Armor of Contempt in an interesting way. So Armor of Contempt reduces the AP value of incoming fire, but the way JINX is worded, it affects the dice roll, and so a weapon with no AP targeting a unit that has Armor of Contempt, and then you JINX it, you still get the -1. So to put it another way, JINX makes weapons with no AP hit as hard as weapons with -2 AP against anything in power armor. That's really good. In the early game, when your Hawks make that battle-focused jump, you probably want to jump into your own backfield so that they can stay totally out of line of sight. As you thin out your opponent's army, you can start instead repositioning them in your opponent's backfield to help score secondary objectives like engage on all fronts or behind enemy lines, and to set up attacks on hard-to-reach objective holders the following turn, right? Not that turn, because they shoot, and then suddenly they're in your opponent's backfield. You want to keep them out of line of sight so that then they jump out and they light up your opponent's backfield objective holders the following turn. Although Hawks are mobile enough to not absolutely require any kind of durability buff because you can usually just hide them, nevertheless, the Phoenix Plume is a really good addition. It grants them a 5-up Feel No Pain and lets them play a little more aggressively. If you have the points to spare, you might also consider Winged Evasion. It's an Exarch power that gives them a native -1 to hit. Now, yes, you can get that anyway with lightning fast reactions, but wouldn't it be nice if you just didn't have to spend that CP, or you could use that stratagem somewhere else? With both of those buffs, you can, especially after the first turn or two, play pretty aggressively with your Hawks. If you plan to run that large Hawk unit, you might even consider making use of To the Last, because that's the one that gives you 5 points at the end of the game for each of your 3 most expensive units. It's really easy to keep some portion of that unit alive until the end of the game. If you are doing that, you definitely want Winged Evasion and the Phoenix Plume. One word of caution, though, if you're using that big unit of Hawks, the Swooping Hawk Grenade Pack stratagem potentially is a trap. So it's really good. You get to roll a die for every Hawk that flies over the enemy, and on a 4-up you do a mortal wound, capped out at 6, but 10 Hawks, that's a lot, right? So you do a bunch of mortal wounds. But you only want to make use of this if you can do it without significantly endangering the unit. The grenade pack is a solid resource, but don't sacrifice a 180-point unit to do 3 or 4 mortal wounds in a narratively badass way. Again, in the late game, once there's not a lot to counter the Hawks, they can come out and these can start dropping grenades on stuff. But aggressive tactics serve you well late, not early. You need to prioritize keeping them alive. The other Hawk build that you might consider is a squad of 5 or 6, primarily to help with secondary scoring, for engage on all fronts and retrieve Nachman data, and maybe even behind enemy lines. The reason to take 6 instead of 5 is so that they can guarantee success when rolling for Nachman data. Remember that you have to roll equal to or under the number of models in the squad, and because it's not a troops unit like the Rangers, it can't auto-succeed with 5 models. Now, advanced players might also considering giving the small squad Suppressing Fire, which is an Exarch power that has a good chance of shutting down Overwatch and preventing the targeted unit from performing actions. This can be good for protecting your Scorpions on turn 1. In the hands of a highly skilled player, potentially you can use it to strip your opponent of some secondary points, right? Because maybe they were counting on maxing out Retrieve Nachman data, and you can actually use this to make that impossible. And those are particularly good points to take away, because when a competitive player is making plans before the game for how they're going to get to a particular score, oftentimes they assume that those Nachman data points are unassailable, but with Hawks they are assailable, so can really foul up your opponent's math. That said, maybe you don't want to buy, I guess, would you need to buy, are they 5 to 6 or 6 to a box now? I'm not even sure. But maybe you don't want to buy 3 or even 4 boxes of Hawks just to get one extra one. You might instead run Warp Spiders in the second iteration with the small squad, because Warp Spiders have similar scoring benefits and also provide really powerful small arms fire against a variety of targets. And although I did not include them in this list, even though they're really, really good, they are probably, for the secondary role, they're probably more versatile than Hawks, especially if you give them Web of Deceit. So not one of the official units on the list, but it is something worth thinking about. Fire Prisms. These gorgeous point-and-click target elimination takes got a big boost in the 9th edition codex. They are effective against all comers, relatively easy to use for new players, and a solid addition to a list, making use of to the last. Novice and veteran players alike may want to consider a pair of these to round out a roster. Now, you probably already know that Prisms have a single powerful heavy weapon with a 60-inch range and 2 shooting profiles, the Focused Lance and the Dispersed Pulse. The Lance profile is heavy 2, strength 14, wow, minus 5 AP, 3d3 damage, 3 to 9 damage, which is just monstrously powerful against hard targets. The Dispersed profile is heavy 3d3, strength 6, minus 2 AP, 2 damage, but blast, really good against heavy infantry, bikers, and even, you don't want to use this on chaff infantry, but if you needed to, you could obliterate a squad. In order for your Fire Prisms to reliably earn their points as target elimination units, you will need to use Strands of Fate dice to guarantee some automatic hits on those Lance profiles. So that's one. They're not cores, so they can't benefit from Autarch rerolls or psychic powers. It doesn't hurt to also have a wound reroll in your back pocket, either because you're running Ulthway or because you have expendable CP in clutch moments. Now, if you run Beltan, by the way, your Prisms just, they'll get a reroll to hit anyway. These work great in a Beltan list. But like all of the units I'm talking about in this video, it doesn't really matter what Craftworld you run, but do figure that if you don't have rerolls to hit, you are going to want to allocate some Strands of Fate die if you have 2 of these. And if you're running Prisms, you want 2 Prisms. The biggest obstacle to using Prisms effectively is that they are so dangerous that your opponent will prioritize eliminating them if she can. And so here's what you need to do. You give both Prisms vectored engines, which allows a vehicle to make a battle focus move once per game. I guess you burn out the engines. Not very Eldari. I feel like their tech would be better, but you sacrifice the engine and you get to make that battle focus move. So what you do is you start both Prisms completely out of line of sight of the enemy, and on turn 1 you poke the hull of one Prism ever so slightly out into the open so that you can target something desirable. Then you use the linked fire stratagem to have both Prisms shoot the target that only one can see with the Lance profile, which also, the linked fire also invalidates invulnerable saves. So man, this is like, it's a Titan killer. It's just a super powerful hit. You point at something, you delete it. Then you battle focus the exposed Prism using vectored engines out of line of sight and repeat with the other Prism on turn 2. And then hopefully by turn 3, your opponent's army will be roughed up enough that you can afford some limited exposure with your Prisms because a lot of their heavy support units have been destroyed, and your Prisms can keep up the barrage. Now, keep in mind that you can alternatively always use Fire and Fade to repeat that move trick without vectored engines, but it's a pretty significant CP expense on top of linked fire. Fire and Fade is 2 CP now, and it's generally not going to be worthwhile. But there might be clutch moments where that's what you need to do. Also keep in mind, in some matchups, you will not even need to hide the Prisms. You can just outrange your opponent with the 60-inch firing solution. So, check before the game starts. Is there anything in the list that will have range on the Prisms? Don't spend CP that you don't need to spend. Lastly, do not forget to make use of the forewarned stratagem if your opponent tries to deep strike something and you have a nearby Farseer that can point at the Prism and say, blast that newly appeared unit. You interrupt your opponent's turn and reduce the interlopers to shuddering jelly. Very satisfying. It's an easy one to forget about, but it's important. If you do decide to run Prisms in a list with to the last, remember that you need to, in the late game, prioritize keeping them alive, not like zipping out to kill stuff and to finish off try to table your opponent or something. Usually the emphasis is going to be on keeping the Prisms alive to the end of the game. But that's only if you take to the last. Falcons. Just in case you didn't get the memo, Falcons have a transport capacity of 6, can deep strike on turn 1, and the models inside can disembark the same turn that they arrive. This means that Falcons can deliver Howling Banshees within striking distance of your opponent turn 1, or drop a unit of Fire Dragons in your opponent's deployment zone without any CP expenditure. They also carry a deadly and customizable heavy support loadout. Every Falcon comes automatically with a pulse laser, a scatter laser, and twin-length shuriken catapults at 140 points. The pulse laser is better than twin bright lances at heavy 2, strength 9, minus 3 AP, D3 plus 3, and a 48-inch range, making the whole package only very slightly overcosted. If it had no transport capacity and no ability to deep strike, it would almost be worth it without those things. With those things, it's a solid deal. My favorite thing about Falcons is that they're just so flexible. When you show up to a game, you can see what your opponent is running and decide what goes inside the Falcon, whether it's starting in deep strike. If you want to make the pulse laser a real killer in some particular game where you need more heavy support fire, you can expend some strands of fate die to make it really reliable. But it's also just fine if you keep your sleek cover tank out of sight in the midfield while it delivers a dangerous unit. The only upgrade to the Falcon that I think you should seriously consider is vectored engines, so that you can pull the same trick on turn 1 that you would with the Fire Prisms, where you like move into the midfield, shoot something, and then battle focus out of line of sight to disgorge your transportees later. Although I mentioned that the heavy support loadout is customizable, I think in general it's probably not worth it. 20 points gets you a single Bright Lance in place of the scatter laser, whereas on a Wave Serpent, 20 points actually gets you 2 Bright Lances. I think it's probably not worth that particular upgrade. But the Falcon is solid. And lastly, Wave Serpents. If you have any ambitions at all to play Craftworld Eldar and you don't have a Wave Serpent in your collection, buy one immediately and then consider getting it a friend. This iconic hover tank may not have sexy tricks or like glamorous damage output, but the Wave Serpent remains one of the most dependable tactical tools in the Craftworld's arsenal. It's a nippy T7 transport with 13 wounds and a spooky shield that gives it a 5-up and vulnerable save against shooting attacks and gives it transhuman, prevents it from ever being wounded on anything less than a 4+. It's so good. Things you might put in your Wave Serpent with its transport capacity of 12 include 2 units of Howling Banshees, 1 large unit of Dire Avengers, and a character or a 2-elf Warlock Conclave, 6 Wraithblades, 1 unit of Banshees, and 1 unit of Fire Dragons, Guardian Defenders, I don't love that one, but people do it, a Warlock Conclave, and some Banshees, or an elaborate picnic service for your elves to enjoy after crushing some ill-evolved enemy. Whatever you stuck in there, it's probably going to be pretty safe until you bring it out. The Serpent's hard to get rid of. There are really only 2 ways to outfit a Serpent, I think. The first is to leave it bare at 140 points. It's what I usually do. If you're playing with this kind of Serpent, you move it into the midfield, you keep it out of line of sight until it disgorges its occupants, after which it does one or more of the following. Grabs an objective, move blocks a key enemy unit. This can be really, if your opponent has some like monster that doesn't fly, that needs to get between buildings or ruins, you can like shut down a whole one whole route for some key unit, key tank or monster. Or it harasses enemy infantry with shuriken fire, which is now way better than it used to be, especially if the target is doomed. So that naked Wave Serpent really has a lot to offer. The other option is to spend the 20 points that I mentioned when talking about Falcons on a pair of Bright Lances and maybe even 10 more on vectored engines. Some people who are very good at this game invariably opt for this build. The vectored engines allow you to fire with the Bright Lances turn 1 without losing a tank, because same as what I explained with the Falcon. And the Bright Lances make your otherwise merely irritating vehicle a serious threat even after it's done its job as a transport. This is an excellent way to play the Serpent. You see it in quite a few high-performing tournament lists. My own personal bias for the first one is really just that. It's a personal bias. The second one's very, very good. Lastly, let's talk about Shield Discharge, which is a 1 CP stratagem that enables you to sacrifice the special defensive buffs inherent to the Wave Serpent in order to deprive an enemy unit of the ability to fire Overwatch and also to give them -1 to hit in melee. The idea here is clearly to nerf a target for some embarked melee unit to charge, but I honestly struggle to imagine what you would ever do this with. Banshees already have both of those advantages inherently. They're already -1 to hit, and they already shut down Overwatch. Wraithblades are generally just too tough to care. It's like, yes, Overwatch my T6 Wraithblades, go for it with their damage reduction. Scorpions don't suffer the indignity of riding around in transports. You just don't do that with Scorpions. So I assume the designers must have had Storm Guardians in mind when they wrote this rule. But Storm Guardians are like 40K content creators who keep inviting Henry Cavill on their channels. They're cute and all, but it's never going to happen. So that's it. If you're looking to get started with Space Elves, the units I talked about in this video will serve you well regardless of what subfaction you're interested in running. And if you're interested in seeing a sample list with just these units, not all of them, but selected exclusively from these units, if you head over to my website, I will link a prose version of this content in the video description, and at the end of it, you can see a sample list. If you have your own ideas about effective units in all Craftworld's lists that are also very accessible to new players, please leave those in the comments below. If you liked this video, I hope that you will consider clicking like. If you have not yet subscribed, I hope that you will subscribe. And if you are interested in obtaining early access to future videos, you might consider heading over to my website and becoming a Patreon. My Patreons will have enjoyed early access to this video. So that's it. Thanks, everybody. I will be back again soon with a couple of shorter videos and additional content that I'm very excited about. Best of luck in your next campaign. Take care.